Big Rob from CelebHeights.com with a celebrity height analysis of one of my favourite films, Aliens. In this video, I'll give you my thoughts on how the actors measure up and just how tall they look at key moments in the movie, basically when they're not kicking alien ass. Now, some films use tricks to make actors taller or shorter, but with Aliens, I think the height of the actors is probably furthest from Cameron's mind. You know, I remember the first time seeing this film back in the late 1980s on Betamax. When you're young, it's like every new movie you watch becomes the best movie ever, but this one has really stuck with me, and 35 years after its release, and about 20 viewings later, it holds up remarkably well, and still holds a spot in my top 10 films of all time. Now, for those of you who haven't seen it, well, stop your grinning and drop your linen, because I highly recommend it. It's classed in the genre of sci-fi action, but actually the first half of the movie is more world building, laying out the cast, the premise and cranking up the tension ever so slowly. Aliens picks up from where the first movie ended. Sigourney Weaver's character Ellen Ripley is adrift in space, and by chance her ship is rescued, and well, she's been asleep in the cryopod for God knows how long. When we go to sleep at night, we're taller in the morning by about 2 centimetres. But imagine being in a deep hypersleep for decades. How tall would you be? The first actor we get to compare Sigourney with is Paul Maxwell, who in the Spotlight casting directory was listed as 5 feet 11. In Aliens, Sigourney's hairstyle is quite thick, but standing beside Maxwell, they look pretty close in height. In this shot, it appears Maxwell is looking down slightly at Sigourney's eyes, and in Sigourney's close-up, she could be looking up slightly at his, although possibly has a fraction less footwear. Of course, I met Sigourney back in 2015 at London Film Con, and she was wearing heels that day that made her look about 6 foot. So take away the heels, and in more recent times, she's probably about 5 foot 10 and a half. So after Ripley discovers they've set up a colony on LV-426, she fears the worst, and it's no surprise that Burke, along with Lieutenant Gorman, soon inform Ripley that they've lost contact with the colony. I met William in 2007. I would have guessed William as about 5 foot 9 and a half, but in the Spotlight directory, he listed himself as being 5 foot 10 and a half. Maybe William does edge Paul out a bit, though playing a Marine, you'd expect William to have the better posture. But how do they shape up against Ripley, who in her room appears to be wearing socks? Reiser does appear that he's looking slightly up at Sigourney, and if he's really 5 foot 10 plus shoes, well, Sigourney has to be over 5 foot 11 there. Same with William. That angle makes Sigourney look a couple of inches taller than William. After persistent nightmares and fear over these aliens, Ripley agrees to tag along as a consultant with the Marines and head back to LV-426. In many films there are scenes we can see actors together, but they're moving and not all have the same posture. I mean, we can get a rough idea that Mark Ralston doesn't look any taller than Sigourney there, although Mark himself once claimed to be 6 foot tall. But I met Mark in person at a supernatural convention, and he was more in the 5 foot 10 range, but maybe in Aliens he was closer to 5 foot 11. James Cameron has written some great roles for women, and Vasquez, the character played by Jeanette Goldstein, is no exception. In this scene with Colette Hiller and Bill Paxton, it's pretty obvious that Vasquez is short. She makes Paxton look huge. As for Colette, well, she claimed to be 5 foot 4 and a half, and having met her once at London Film Con, I think she's pretty close to that height. So what about Jeanette then? Well, she listed herself as 5 feet 2 inches, but in a podcast mentioned that she was barely that height. I've met Jeanette on a couple of occasions, and both times she had more footwear than me, so I'd say she was pretty honest when stating that she was barely 5 foot 2. I'm not entirely sure what height Bill Paxton claimed. In Aliens, there's not many scenes that can actually give us good comparisons, but I am honoured to have actually met Bill in person at 2015's London Film Con, and up close, I thought he was just under 6 foot. With the Marines prepping the dropship, we finally get to see Sigourney with 2 other actors. Al Matthews, who plays Sergeant Apone, and Michael Bain, who plays Corporal Hicks. The original actor who played Hicks was James Remar, but after a few weeks was fired. Seeing James in person, I'd estimate he was about 5'9", but probably shrunk from the mid-1980s, and around the time of Aliens was 5'10". But back to Al Matthews and Michael Biehn. Both actors claim to be 6 foot tall, and I do think that Biehn is pretty close to that mark, edging out Al ever so slightly. Also, Michael looks a bit taller than Sigourney there, and later in the film, we get to see Hicks giving some pulse rifle tips to Ripley, and he also seems to edge her out there. I've met Michael on a couple of occasions. Back in 2009, I thought he stood pretty well and was almost 6 foot. Talking about posture and camera angles, the second time I met Michael, his posture was looser, but then so was mine. But look at the change in camera angles going from portrait to landscape mode. It actually looks like I've got more of a lean in the landscape than the portrait, but the height difference actually looks greater in the portrait shot. Once Sigourney and the Marines set down on the planet, the opportunities for comparing height, they dry up a bit. Though we can still see that with low angle shots, that Jeanette is noticeably shorter than Bill. And here the actor Rico Ross, who's standing behind Sigourney, still looks taller. I've met Rico a couple of times, and although he claimed to be 6'3", I don't think in person he was over 6'2". When the Marines first detect movement in the complex, we get a chance to see William Hope beside Michael Biehn, and the difference, it looks a good 2 inches there. And even though Sigourney is further away, look at their chins. It's quite believable to think that Sigourney is 2 inches taller than William. The Marines discover that the movement was actually the remaining colony survivor, Newt, played by Carrie Henn. I've no idea how tall she is in this movie, but as an adult, I did meet Carrie at LFCC, and with a bit more footwear than myself, I'd guessed Carrie was between 5'6" and 7. The cast of Aliens isn't particularly large, and there's a few minor characters like Dietrich, played by Cynthia Dale Scott, who just pop up in a few scenes. I met Cynthia in 2009, and up close she was somewhere in the 5'7" range. Another minor character, Spunkmeyer, played by Daniel Cash, doesn't really have any height comparison scenes we can use. I mean, we briefly see Daniel beside Lance on the ship, but can't really tell much about his height. But you can rely on me. I did meet Daniel in person, and he looked roughly about 5'10½", although he did have more footwear than Jenny and myself. Cash is another actor who claimed to be 6 foot in the Spotlight directory. I mean, what is it with aliens and 6 foot height claimers? In film, there's always camera angle and actor positions that help one side but hinder the other. For instance, here we have Burke appearing taller than Ripley, but when we switch positions, Ripley is now a couple of inches taller than Burke. After about 2/3 of the movie, we also finally get the opportunity to see a decent shot of Bishop and Ripley, and he looks about 2 inches shorter there. I first met Lance Henriksen back in 2006, and I reckoned he was about my height, but Aliens was 20 years earlier, and he was bound to have lost some height because he looked about 5'9" range there. In the last half hour of the movie, it's mostly Ripley and Newt fighting the aliens, although we do get one more chance to see Ripley and Bishop in a wide shot, and again, it looks a good 2 inches difference. So guys, if you enjoy this type of height analysis, then let me know with a like and a comment. But in the meantime, go and watch Aliens. Now, what are you waiting for?